This topographic map shows the Strait of Hormuz. At its narrowest point, the shipping lanes connecting the Persian Gulf to the open ocean are just 21 miles wide. Under normal conditions, roughly 1/5 of the world's seaborne oil trade passes through this single geographical bottleneck. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury. The kinetic military campaign targeted Iranian infrastructure and immediately turned the world's most critical energy transit corridor into an active war zone. This line chart shows the immediate financial reaction. The international oil benchmark, Brent crude, spiked violently from $71 per barrel to near $120 per barrel by mid-March. Economic damage on this scale usually follows the physical destruction of oil fields, but in 2026, the oil stayed in the ground. It was simply trapped behind a paralyzed transit corridor. To understand how a localized maritime disruption overpowered the global supply chain, we have to forensically track the initial kinetic strikes, the failure of traditional market stabilizers, the asymmetric macroeconomic fallout, and the fragile diplomatic resolution that followed. The events of early 2026 proved that a logistics blockade is structurally more severe than a traditional production loss shock because it traps existing global capacity behind invisible geopolitical walls. The 2026 conflict followed the collapse of Oman-mediated nuclear talks. The opening US and Israeli airstrikes achieved a targeted decapitation of Iranian leadership, killing Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and dozens of senior officials. This high-altitude satellite view shows Iran's primary nuclear facility complex. The operational objective of the airstrikes was the total destruction of this deeply buried nuclear infrastructure, requiring the use of 30,000-pound precision-guided bunker busters. The legality of these strikes was immediately contested. More than 100 international law scholars published assessments arguing the campaign violated UN Charter Article 2.4, categorizing the operation as an illegal preventive war, absent an imminent armed attack. The US State Department rejected this framework. They invoked Article 51 of the UN Charter, classifying the operation not as a new war, but as an act of continuous collective self-defense against a long-term pattern of Iranian aggression. In immediate strategic retaliation, Iran terminated all International Atomic Energy Agency safeguards and suspended monitoring access to its declared nuclear sites. This combination of physical airstrikes and suspended safeguards created an unresolvable intelligence blind spot. The international community lost all ability to verify the condition or location of Iran's estimated 400-kilogram stockpile of 60% enriched uranium. By March 4, Iran declared the Strait of Hormuz closed. The physical mechanics of the blockade stranded thousands of vessels and caused a 95 to 99% collapse in tanker traffic through the corridor. This chart reveals the velocity of the price shock. While impacts of the 1973 embargo, 1990 Gulf War, and 2022 Russian invasion built up over months, the 2026 shock outperformed them in weeks. Brent crude peaked near $120 and Dubai hit $166. Because the strait is a universal transit route, the impact jumped immediately to adjacent commodities. Qatar Energy declared force majeure on its liquefied natural gas exports, causing European natural gas prices to double almost overnight. Outside the active conflict zone, a massive maritime bottleneck formed. An estimated 20,000 commercial mariners found themselves physically stranded on idling vessels, waiting for clearance that would not come for months. A 21-mile logistics closure creates a faster, more violent commodity contagion than multi-year economic sanctions or terrestrial military campaigns. Heading into 2026, the oil industry operated under the assumption that modern markets were resilient. High non-OPEC production and massive spare capacity were expected to serve as geographical hedges against Middle Eastern conflict. When prices spiked, the market expected United States horizontal drilling to act as a rapid swing producer. It did not. This dual-axis chart contrasts the soaring Brent crude price against a largely flat U.S. rig count. Because producers were committed to strict capital discipline and held a record low inventory of drilled but uncompleted wells, physical extraction faced a multi-month operational lag. The global cartel fared no better. OPEC Plus held an estimated 4.4 million barrels per day of theoretically usable spare capacity, but they were caught in a geographic trap. The vast majority of this spare capacity belonged to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. It was physically unexportable, trapped behind the blocked strait. Frustrated by bearing the direct military risk and the economic burden of constrained quotas without the ability to export their capacity, the UAE abruptly withdrew from OPEC in late April 2026. Global economic buffers are an illusion if their physical output cannot navigate geopolitical choke points or outpace the timeline of the crisis. The resulting macroeconomic shockwaves hit the globe with varying severity, depending entirely on a nation's position as a net energy exporter or an import-dependent consumer. In the United States, Dallas Fed modeling tracked a 4.2% spike in headline CPI. It was a frustrating headwind that forced the Federal Reserve to pause planned rate cuts, but the domestic economy absorbed the shock. In emerging markets like Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, the lack of domestic energy production led to systemic collapse. Governments were forced to implement 4-day workweeks and strict fuel rationing just to keep their power grids online. The market contagion soon bled downstream into global agriculture. The Persian Gulf is responsible for roughly 45% of global sulfur production, a critical input for modern farming. This flow map traces cascading failure. The stranding of ammonia and sulfur doubled global fertilizer prices, effectively transforming a regional energy shock into a global food security crisis. In modern decoupled markets, a singular logistics shock delivers localized inflation to exporters while dealing multi-system collapse to importers. After months of economic hemorrhaging, a diplomatic off-ramp was achieved on June 17, 2026. Mediated by Pakistan and Qatar, the United States and Iran signed the bilateral Islamabad Memorandum. The core mechanism of the agreement was a 60-day window featuring a toll-free reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, designed strictly to pause active hostilities. Compared to the 159-page technical rigor of the 2015 JCPOA, the Islamabad Memorandum was remarkably thin, containing just 14 points of framework text. It deferred critical strategic issues. It left the disposition of Iran's nuclear material entirely unresolved, and failed to address the parallel Israel-Lebanon conflict, threatening to collapse the ceasefire at any moment. But the physical reality on the water was undeniable. The ships began to move, and global trade tentatively resumed its flow through the 21-mile channel. The 2026 war rewrote risk models. It proved weaponizing maritime logistics can override aggregate supply, exposing fractures in global cartels, and leaving the global economy dependent on a ceasefire that remains technically and diplomatically unfinished.